everybody. Thank you, Hillary. Um, so my name is Mark Martinez. Any pronouns are fine. Quickly, a little bit about me. I'm legal counsel and budget director for state senator here in Massachusetts, Pat Jalen, who represents Somerville, Cambridge, Medford, and Winchester. And in that role, policy is what I do, right? Which is, I think, why I'm giving this talk tonight, because we're going to talk about policy. We're going to talk about bills being passed or attempting to being passed throughout the country that are, anti-LGBTQ bills, in particular anti-trans bill, and to really hyper focus, mostly targeting trans youth. And so I've got a brief presentation that I'm going to give. It's not long, mostly because it's a high level review in hopes that we can dive a little bit deeper in conversation afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and start that presentation now. If you have questions as we go along, if you want to drop them in the chat so that I can see them when we're done, or also once we're done, you can just come off mute and ask whatever questions you have or clarifications. So let me start. Sorry, one moment. All right. So, like I said, we're going to talk about anti-trans legislation happening in the U.S. right now, and what's really going on. Kind of, what's the story behind it? What are they doing, and why are they doing it? At least as far as I can gather. A couple, I guess, disclaimers. Like I said, I do work for an elected official, which is why every time I start talking, I have to make sure that I am clear that everything I say here these are my personal views. They are not necessarily reflective of my boss, though she may agree with some of them, or maybe all of them. But this is just me. And the other thing that I want to be clear about, that I think will come out as this presentation goes along, is that I am certainly to the left of the political spectrum. Like I said, I work in politics. Nonpartisan is not really a thing that I do, but I just want to make sure that we're on the same page with where I'm coming from. So real quick, just kind of want to lay out the things that we're, that I'm briefly going to cover here. So we're going to talk about the types of legislation being introduced and where they're being introduced. The damage caused by both introducing and passing these types of legislation. Obviously, passing this legislation creates long-lasting harm, but just the introduction also causes harm because it brings, this debate over trans people and their identities to the public eye, as if there's something to debate there. We're going to talk about the impacts of this and how this spans beyond. This does not just have an impact on trans people and on trans youth. We're going to talk about whether there's actually a problem that these laws are trying to address. So I want to be clear up front. No, right? I don't want to let that linger, but I think it's important to talk about, and we'll see why. Beyond some people's genuine attempt to just want to hurt trans people and LGBTQ people, what's really going on, behind these bills. Why is this happening? We're going to chat about that a little bit. And lastly, we're going to talk about Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts likes to put itself off as this super progressive state, and I think in lots of areas it's got lots of work to do. But we're going to talk a little bit, briefly about some things that Massachusetts could be doing to better support the LGBTQ community. So what are we talking about? And so the legislation that we're talking about that's been introduced kind of throughout the country generally falls underneath kind of three categories. And some states are trying to do all three or a combination. But bans on trans participation in youth sports / locker rooms. This is kind of an offshoot of, a couple years ago, the big thing were the quote unquote bathroom bills. And I think this was kind of locker rooms and these bans on trans participation in youth. In particular, trans girls participating for gendered sports, participating in the sport that aligns with their gender identity. Bans on trans affirming healthcare for youth, right? Your next step up. So these are states that are genuinely trying to block trans youth from getting gender affirming care, and in some places criminalizing it, and making it so that if parents try to affirm their child's gender, that their children can actually be taken away. And then lastly, curriculum bans, ID restrictions. So bans on curriculums that include LGBTQ history and trans history, limitations on IDs, and things of that nature. Over 100 bills have been introduced in 33 different states. And if that sounds like a lot, that's because it is. Even for kind of historically what normally happens. And so here's a little graphic that, this is from the Human Rights Campaign, and this tracks the different types of anti-transgender bills that have been introduced throughout the years. And as you can see, dramatic increase in 2021. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And so, I want to talk about obviously the impact on trans youth, which are obviously the people most impacted by the legislation that I mentioned. If you're not familiar, I say obviously, and it may not be obvious. So, but LGBTQ youth in general disproportionately struggle with anxiety and depression when compared to their cisgendered and straight counterparts. That's been well documented. I'm happy to send resources, but we know that to be true. But the other thing that's going to be true is this can be mitigated for trans youth that receive gender affirming care and just kind of gender affirmation at a younger age, meaning the younger that they have access either to healthcare or just someone that affirms their gender, somebody that affirms their identity, those incidences that disproportionate impact their mental health decreases quite a bit. According to a recent study, those that get it, that gender affirming care and just general affirmation, have lower incidences of reported depression, self-harm, suicide, or attempted suicide, or required, psychoactive medications. And I think this makes sense, at least to me, is that, I think it's natural for anyone, trans or not. We want to be affirmed in who we are, and we want to be supported. And the younger that we get that, especially for trans youth, there's just remarkably better outcomes really across the board. And so I think it's really important that we center them, because these are kids, right? These are just kids trying to play sports with their friends. And as someone that played sports growing up, those are really important to me. The bonds that I made, the skills that I developed by being a part of a team. I couldn't imagine being banned from doing that, being banned from interacting and playing and participating in sports with my friends. I think I want to talk about, another thing I want to talk about is, the kind of slippery slope that we enter into when we start talking about banning trans identity based, on, sex assigned at birth. So some of you may remember Caster Semenya from 2 years ago. So she's a two-time South African Olympic gold medalist. She was a powerhouse in the track and field, particularly the 800-meter race. And she was beating everybody. Like I said, two-time Olympic gold medalist, multiple time over world champion. And she was banned from competing unless she artificially altered the hormones that her body naturally produced. So what was happening with Caster was that through nothing that she did, through no kind of artificial means, her body just naturally produced more testosterone than most women's bodies do. And so she was competing and basically she got banned, and she ended up appealing all the way up to, there's this kind of there's this court for, the governing body of this sport. And they basically said that unless she then artificially reduced that, so, took hormone replacements, any number of things, and they put caps on, the amount of testosterone that a woman could have in their body if they wanted to participate in that sport, which is really interesting because, one of the things that we hear all the time from the people that support these bills is that, it's biology, right? You're either born a man or a woman. You either have two X chromosomes or an XY chromosome. And the simple fact of the matter is that it's far more complicated than that. And I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to dive deep into that part of it, but it is far more complicated. And if the idea here is to just go with biology, then Castor should have never been banned from participating in the sport because this is biology. This is how she was born. Nobody banned, part of the reason that Michael Phelps was able to win all the gold medals that he did is his body produced half the amount of lactate that the average person did, which allowed him to not get fatigued and allowed his body to kind of regenerate faster. And he got praised for it, right? He won more gold medals than anybody, and he was an international hero to everybody, even though he just had a kind of natural biological advantage, much like Castor. But he was not penalized for that. And also multiple news sources throughout this incorrectly reported Castor as being a transgender woman, which he's not. Castor is a cisgender woman. Her body just, again, biology is complicated. It's far more complicated than the proponents of these things would lead you to believe. But again, I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to dive deep into that. I want to share a clip. So if you were to believe the people introducing these bills throughout the country, you would believe that all over the place, there are little boys pretending to be girls so they can get this competitive advantage in sports. So there's this massive problem all over the place. And it's simply not true, right? Trans people have been competing in sports as long as sports have been around. And what obviously we do not see anywhere are trans people dominating any sport. It just hasn't happened. And it's not going to happen. But this is a clip from West Virginia governor after he signed one of these bills banning trans girls from participating in girl sports. So I'm going to play that.
You just signed banning transgender female athletes from playing on women's school sports teams. Can you name one example of a transgender child trying to gain an unfair competitive advantage at a school there in West Virginia?
Well, Stephanie, I don't have that experience exactly to myself right now, but I will tell you this.
Not yourself, your state, sir. Can you give me one example of a transgender child trying to get an unfair advantage? Just one in your state. You signed a bill about it.
No, I can't really tell you one, but I can tell you this, Stephanie. I'm a coach, and I coach a girls basketball team, and I can tell you that we all know what an absolute advantage boys would have playing against girls.
But sir, you have no examples of this happening. Why would you take your time to do this? Let's talk about other things that I can give you examples of in your state. According to U.S. News and World Report, West Virginia ranks 45th in education, 47th in healthcare, 48th on the economy, and 50th in infrastructure. If you cannot name one single example for me of a child doing this, why would you make this a priority? I just named 4 things that would seem to me like a much bigger priority.
Well, Stephanie, I didn't make it a priority. It wasn't my bill.
You signed it.
I mean, it's just come to me, and I've absolutely signed it because I believe, from the standpoint of a coach, I believe that girls work so hard to obtain Title IX, and I do not have any idea now why we are trying to disadvantage them in participating in the sport that they put so much into. I don't know why we're doing that. This is not like it's a big priority to me. In fact, I think we only have 12. No, Stephanie, listen. I think we only have 12 kids, maybe in our state, that are transgender type kids. I mean, for crying out loud, Stephanie, I signed hundreds of bills. This is not a priority to me. And but with all that, I would say I think that it would impose an unfair disadvantage on the girls. And so from that standpoint, I support it.
All right then, sir. Thank you. And please come back when beyond anecdotal feelings as a coach, you can show me evidence where those young women are being disadvantaged in your state, because I can show you evidence about how ranking that low in education is disadvantaging young women and men in West Virginia. Thanks for your time. The law you just signed.
So I wanted to show that for a couple of reasons. One, I think it shows the talking points that people use, even though, again, they're just not accurate. And two, to show that, you know, these are addressing a problem that clearly doesn't really exist. And as someone that works in state government, it's hard to get state government to focus on the problems that do exist. So for them to spend time on a problem that doesn't is really troubling. And I think obviously it begs the question of why. Why is this happening? And I want to be clear, part of it is cruelty. Part of it is hate. Part of it is a fear of things that are different. And that leads people to do really terrible things, right? And there's some other things that I want to talk about, but I first want to highlight that unfortunately for a lot of people, cruelty is the point. And I don't want that to be lost. And so you might have heard this term of kind of the culture war that, you know, dates back to, I mean, a long time, but really kind of came into prominence in the 70s. And it was this idea of, right, and this was an intentional Republican strategy. This is not me, pontificating, coming up with these things, right? This is well documented. And what was happening was that, the Republican kind of strategists at the time, dating back to the 70s, were kind of worried that, their positions were not appealing. Their policy were not appealing to the kind of general public. And so what they did was start, talking about values rather than specific policies. They really just trying to talk about, American values, and this is what we're selling, rather than selling, the kind of the policies that they were trying to develop. And this actually started with abortion in the 1970s. That was really the first, this was an intentional strategy on Republicans to bring in, evangelicals and Catholics into the party. Abortion didn't used to break down the party lines that we see now. It wasn't something that was really discussed in the national stage. What they realized was that, there were people that felt really passionate about this issue, and realized this could bring people in. This is still true to this day. You'll see a lot of these people that are kind of one issue voters, openly identify as one issue voters, and their one issue is abortion, or lots of people that are multiple issue voters. And, the Republican Party doesn't necessarily align with them on everything else, but abortion is their number one thing. And so, like I said, that, the Republican Party used that kind of as a ploy to get more people in. And, I think these attacks on trans lives are kind of the next step. Again, right, it's really similar messaging to what they've done with so many other things, right? It's not really a policy position. Most people are never going to interact with a trans student participating in sports. People that don't even have children are really concerned about this. And like I said before, I think it traces back to a fear of the unknown, and kind of a changing of a quote unquote American way of life. And this is just kind of the next battle in this war. Is trans youth, and it's really, really sad, obviously, because these are young people's lives that are at stake, and they're kind of being used as a ploy. And I would also like to be clear, it's being used on a ploy by both sides. I think obviously the Republicans, or at least I don't want to say all Republicans, but the ones that are pushing this are trying to kind of wage war on trans youth. And I also want to be clear, and we'll talk about this when we get to, what can Massachusetts do better. Democrats also, will kind of support trans people with their words, but not necessarily the policies that they're enacting. And so I think both sides are really guilty of using, in particular, trans youth as kind of a pawn in this game to attract voters. And as someone that works in politics, it's a hard reality to swallow. And so then the last thing I want to talk about, Massachusetts still has a lot of work to do. I think what's happened in Massachusetts is, as you may know, we were the first state to have same-sex marriage, and we've kind of ridden that sense when it comes to LGBTQ issues. I think what Mass has done, and I want to be clear, they've done a good amount, right? They've kind of checked the big boxes of same-sex marriage and workplace protections and having sexual orientation as a protected class, and those are big, those are huge, those are really important. That doesn't exist everywhere, so I want to be clear that those things are really important. We last 2 years ago banned conversion therapy in Massachusetts, which is great, though we were, I think, the 13th or the 14th state to do it, so a little upsetting that it took that long. And then last year we also finally got gender X markers on IDs. So for, gender nonconforming people that don't identify with, male or female, identify with binary, that option was given. And that's really important. But there are other things, right? There are things that still need to be done in Massachusetts to really create an environment in which LGBTQ people across the board feel safe and supported. And what that really comes down to, there are just a lot of things that I think the casual observer don't identify as quote unquote LGBTQ issues, but are issues and policy areas that are disproportionately impacting the LGBTQ community. And that's kind of where we need to focus. LGBTQ inclusive curriculums in schools, including sexual education. So teaching, young queer kids that, their history is a part of our history. It's built into their curriculum. And culturally competent sexual education. I know when I grew up in Massachusetts, in Western Mass. I live in Boston now, but grew up in Western Mass. There was no LGBTQ inclusive sexual education. And that leads to really bad health outcomes for LGBTQ youth, and then all the way up until adulthood. So that's something that needs to happen. Better homelessness prevention programs. So the homeless population in Massachusetts and really everywhere is disproportionately LGBTQ people, in particular LGBTQ people of color. And that's for a lot of reasons. That's because of, workplace discrimination and not being able to get a good paying job. It's from, being detached from family, family not being accepting, and either home not being a safe place or not being an option because you've been removed from the home because of your identity. And so, homelessness or housing instability is really one of the biggest issues facing, in particular, LGBTQ youth. And if you want more information on that, the Mass Commission on LGBTQ Youth just released their annual recommendations. It's a very long document, very comprehensive, but has really incredible policies, really all-encompassing, that are designed to improve the life of LGBTQ youth in Massachusetts. Along with that, LGBTQ competent shelter systems, especially trans individuals. So a lot of the shelters in Mass are broken out by gender, and some aren't accepting of kind of trans people, or they say that they are, but just are not culturally competent and say and do things that are really harmful that make shelters places that trans people don't feel comfortable and don't feel safe in, so they don't use them. And, the other thing I would add to this, I think I forgot to add to the list, but also LGBTQ competent healthcare. I'm very fortunate. I live in Boston, and Fenway Health is one of, if not the best hospital in the country for LGBTQ healthcare. But that's not the case everywhere. And there are large parts of Massachusetts where that's just not the case. And I don't, as much as I love Fenway, I don't think what should happen is that people have to keep on traveling, or that Fenway is this kind of beacon. I think it should be the norm. Whether or not you're particularly focused on this population the way that Fenway Health is, every trans or queer person in the Commonwealth and anywhere, but focusing on the Commonwealth, should be able to walk into their doctor's office and know that they're going to get culturally competent care, know that they're going to have someone that understands what being transgender is, that understands the importance of using the correct pronouns, that doesn't stigmatize, the sex life and sexual choices of LGBTQ individuals. And that's just not the case. And that leads to really bad health outcomes, because a lot of trans people in particular just won't go to the doctor until it's too late, until something has really gone wrong. So really it prevents preventative care and prevents sometimes life-saving and care. And so that is another thing that, Massachusetts needs to be doing a lot better at. Data collection on LGBTQ individuals really across all systems, criminal justice system, the mental health system, housing, really across the board. Massachusetts does a really bad job of collecting data specifically in this population. And they're not great in other areas, right? They've worked on it when it comes to race and gender, but so many of our reporting systems don't include LGBTQ individuals, or don't include them in a really inclusive and expansive way, which makes it really hard, right? You can't manage what you don't measure, and it's really hard to address a problem if you don't have data and facts behind it, and we can't have that data if we're not collecting it. And so it ends up being a really huge barrier to people advocating for really anything that benefits LGBTQ individuals, because people want to see data, people want to see evidence that there's a problem. And if we're not collecting that data, it becomes really hard to prove that, even though anecdotally we may know. People want data. And I think, and that's not a bad thing. I think that's how it should be. I think our responses should be data driven when possible. The decriminalization of sex work, and this is obviously a more controversial one, but tied to the disproportionate, tied to LGBTQ people being the disproportionate population of unhoused people, that also leads to things like them, disproportionately making up sex workers, or disproportionate people engaging in sex work. And oftentimes, and there is some data on this, but the sex work and what we call night walking statutes are disproportionately used, particularly in trans people, and particularly trans people of color, particularly trans Black women, are disproportionately arrested and charged under these statutes. That is, so I'm going to stop sharing. That is the end of that presentation. So I can take a break from talking. All right. I'll take a sip. So that was, I think, a lot of information. I tried not to have too much information, but I kind of get carried away sometimes. So I would like to pause and see if there are questions, comments, concerns, responses that people have.
So Mark, I can break the ice with a question that came in through the chat from someone while you were speaking. And the question that this person asked was basically, in your opinion or your experience working in the legal system in Massachusetts, what is one of the most crucial pieces of legislation or initiatives that are going on in Massachusetts right now as pertains to the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I always want to start with housing. I think housing is such a crucial part Right, housing is wrapped up in so many things. People that are unhoused have so many other, really bad outcomes with mental health, substance use, right, linked to shorter lifespans. So many things are impacted, being underemployed or unemployed. And it really is, this like I said, homelessness, being unhoused disproportionately impacts LGBTQ people in stark ways, right? It's really bad. And so the first thing is people need to be housed. And obviously, the last 14 months of the pandemic has not helped that situation. It's made things a lot worse for a lot of people. So that's really a huge one. And then really just kind of across the board, LGBTQ competent, whatever, care, education, is just going to be such a huge part of everything that we do, because we can, right, we can only legislate so much, right? We can create all the best systems in the world. If the people operating those systems and on the ground are not approaching those services from a way that is inclusive of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't really matter, right? Like I talked about the shelter systems and how some of them really are just not welcoming to LGBTQ people. We could put shelters on every corner. We could put housing on every corner for people. If it's not done in a way that's going to affirm and welcome people in, then it doesn't matter. And same thing with healthcare, right? Obviously, right, Massachusetts has had universal health care long before the Affordable Care Act came around, and that's great. And there's lots of improvements that we could be making to mass health, but it's there. But again, if you're a trans person in particular, and every time you go into your doctor's office, you're misgendered and not treated with respect, guess what? You're going to stop going to your doctor, which is not good, because, obviously, preventative care is huge. Even just normal checkups are really important to catch a lot of things and can drastically improve health outcomes. I mean, I know before I moved to Boston, I hated going to the doctor, because anytime I went into, my doctor back home in Western Mass, as, a queer man, every single time I went in, it was, oh, well, we better test you for HIV, because like that must be what it is. And like, that's just not, it's not an environment that I want to go into. Like, I don't want everything to come back to my sexuality. Like, sometimes I'm just sick because I'm a human being and I get sick. So I think that's really important. And in general, what I'll say is, obviously with the last year, there's been lots of conversations all across the country about the role of police and criminalization in the United States in particular. And again, so many things, right, are as always, just disproportionately impact this community, especially if they're, people of color in the LGBTQ community. There's disproportionate kind of victimization at the hands of the police. And so I think, that has to enter into the conversation as well. Again, I always like to, like I said, use, personal experience. I was very nearly, while in Boston a few years ago, the victim of a hate crime. And I didn't contact the police because they didn't think that they were going to make me feel safer. And that's a very real problem. And so if we're talking about what's going to keep, LGBTQ people safe, we've got to look at all of the things that are making them feel unsafe.
So we have another question in the chat there.
Yeah.
Or it just came in through the chat, sorry. So what other organizations other than Fenway Health are doing a good job for the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, so there's, like I said, the Mass Commission on LGBTQ Youth does an incredible job of, these incredibly deep dives on policy and incredible advocacy. So we'll definitely check them out. Mass Equality, which is kind of a grassroots statewide organization, which I I feel it's important to note that I'm on the board of Mass Equality, so I just want to make sure that is clear. And then from there, it really depends on kind of what you're getting at, right? So Black and Pink is an organization in Massachusetts that supports LGBTQ individuals that are incarcerated or leaving incarceration. And so they're doing really good work as well. Okay, they're on the local level, especially during COVID, right? There's been a lot of kind of mutual aid groups that have started. And, like I said, there's Trans Resistance is an incredible organization in Massachusetts that currently right now is trying to, they're in a campaign to raise $250,000 so that they can support trans people with housing and with dollars and with actual assistance. If you live in or around Boston, which I may be the only one, but they just had a really incredible march this past weekend that they organized, really centering trans people, in particular, trans people of color. So Trans Resistance and the Trans Emergency Fund are absolutely organizations that I would check out. Because the other thing is, I think a lot of times people look for, what policies can I advocate for to help people? And I think that, right, as someone that works in policy, I think that's really huge. But I also think a lot of times what people need, quite frankly, is they just need money, right? They just need something kind of get them through the next day, something to help them get housing, something to help them get food. And so Trans Resistance and the Trans Emergency Fund, which they overlap. So if you end up checking out either or, you'll get plugged in. But I think those are definitely the organizations that I would kind of uplift.
So that sort of speaks in some ways to another question that came in through the chat, which was, what is a tangible action that any individual can undertake? But it sounds like contributing to those kinds of funds might be your primary recommendation.
Definitely contributing to those funds is really big and really important because those are the organizations, right? Those are grassroots local organizations, right? And I don't mean to disparage like the national organizations that do this work. I think they do important things, but obviously a much smaller percentage of your money goes directly into communities when you give to these larger organizations, right? And that's not even necessarily, and I think that's like a nefarious thing. So they've got these massive operations that they have to fund and they have to pay for. Whereas when, I always recommend looking into, local community orgs, mutual aid groups, because they don't have as much overhead. Way more of your dollar goes directly into the community. And also these are, the people running these funds are in the community, right? They're part of these communities, or organizing these communities all the time. So they really know where the money needs to go. They really know, how that money is going to make the most impact. Right. It's like places that sort of unhoused people, right, that take donations. So many times they get so many donations of things that they just don't need because people that aren't in the community are like, oh, well, this is what they want. This is what they need, or this is what somebody told me. When really oftentimes it's not that, and they need different things, which is why, like I said, if you have the ability to, giving money to these orgs, giving time to these orgs as well can be really helpful. But so I think that's always a tangible thing that you can do. And then of course, the other thing that you can do is, pay attention to what's happening at the state house, and, call your local, call your state rep, call your state senator, and ask them to support, bills that are going to uplift, LGBTQ people, because, right, a lot of times what moves elected officials are their constituents, the people that vote for them, calling them, right? 7,000 bills get filed at the State House every year. It's impossible to know what they all are, what they all do, and keep track of all of them. And so people need to be reminded that these things are out there and that they need to be supporting them.
If you can bear with me, we have one last question.
Yeah, of course.
And so the last question that came in was, why do you feel like it is this moment when all of this new anti-trans legislation is being introduced? Like, basically, why is this the new abortion, like, as far as the culture wars go?
You know, I think they just, I think it's a combination of things. I think one, they just kind of look around and find something and see what sticks. But I also think more so ever than now, trans people are living out loud and proud, right? And they're not in the shadows anymore. They're not hiding it. Obviously, plenty of them are, but it's they are in media, right? Movies, TV, on the news, more than ever before, at least, again, like I said, openly. And so I think that people are really being confronted with this. You know, if you look at polls of, you know, the younger generation, Gen Z, and I think whoever comes after them yet isn't quite old enough to be polled, but right, what you see is more and more people identifying as members of the LGBT community, identifying as trans, identifying as gender nonconforming. And so I think, right, like it's hard to ignore. And so I think they see that wave coming and are doing their damnedest to kind of beat it back, which is right, really sad and unfortunate. Right, in a lot of places, these bills haven't been successful, and that's great, but they have been successful in other places. Right, Arkansas passed a bill that straight up like bans trans youth from getting gender affirming care, and that's like so incredibly dangerous. It's so dangerous, like that, like to say that that is like a matter of life and death is not an exaggeration. And so I think that's why. Yeah, that's kind of my best guess.
Okay, so I think that that's all of the questions that had come in through the chat. If anybody has any other questions that they'd like to pose at this point, please feel free. I don't see anyone jumping up, so I guess I would just like to say thank you again. Thank you, Mark, for the very informative presentation and for all of your insights. And thank you to everybody who came by to participate and for your questions and for your attention.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the questions and the interest. It is really important. You know, luckily we live in a state where these types of laws aren't being introduced, and that's great. But like I said, you know, there's still stuff that we can do. And also nowhere in our country should we be okay with anyone being treated like this, but children, right? Like children are supposed to kind of be the sacred thing that we don't touch, and we all agree need to be protected. And so to have this carve out for this population of children is dangerous and sad to see. So, but yeah, thank you. Like I said, thanks for your interest, and thanks for.
What she wrote.
Okay. So again, on behalf of the library, thank you to everyone, and I hope that you have a great evening.
Have a great night, everybody. Bye.
That's what you